Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm Ryan, and today we're diving into a really useful and practical topic: how to confidently talk about your job in English. Now, this is something that comes up in so many situations, whether you're at a networking event, a job interview, or even just chatting with friends who don't work in your field. The ability to explain what you do clearly and confidently can make a huge difference in how people perceive you and the opportunities that come your way. I've helped many professionals improve their communication skills over the years, and I can tell you that having this skill under your belt can really set you apart. So, we're here today to help you with that.
Absolutely, Ryan. This is something that's close to my heart because I've personally gone through this journey. When I first started in my industry, explaining my job to non-technical people was such a challenge. I would stumble over my words or use jargon that people didn't understand, and I could see their eyes glazing over. It was frustrating because I knew exactly what I did, but I just couldn't get it across in a way that made sense to others. Over time, I realized it wasn't just about knowing my job. It was about communicating it clearly, no matter who I was talking to. And trust me, once you get the hang of it, everything changes. You gain more confidence, and conversations become easier, even enjoyable.
Yeah, exactly. It's like unlocking a new skill. Once you can talk about your job in a way that others understand and relate to, you open up so many more doors. And today, we'll break it down step by step. Whether you're struggling with finding the right words or just want to polish how you present yourself, we've got you covered. All right, let's jump into why it's so important to be able to talk about your job clearly, especially in English. Whether you're at a networking event, in an interview, or even having a casual conversation, how you explain your job can really shape the way people see you. Think about it. If you can communicate your role and responsibilities in a way that's both clear and engaging, you come across as more professional and competent. Plus, people are more likely to remember you and what you do. On the flip side, if you struggle to explain your job, it can make you seem uncertain, even if you're great at what you do. And that's not the impression we want to leave, right? Another thing to remember is that explaining your job isn't just for formal settings like interviews. It can be incredibly helpful in everyday life too. If you're at a social event or someone asks you out of the blue what you do, being able to answer with confidence helps you build connections. People will respect that you can talk about your work, and they'll likely ask more questions or even offer opportunities. So, having that clarity in how you speak about your role is key.
You're spot on, Ryan. I remember this one time when I was at a professional meetup and someone asked me what I did. I started talking, but I got too deep into technical details, and I could see the confusion on their face. That moment made me realize how important it is to tailor the way I talk about my job depending on who's listening. If I'm talking to someone outside of my industry, I need to explain it simply. That moment was a real turning point for me because it showed how critical it is to be adaptable. I had to learn to make my job sound approachable to anyone, whether they're in my field or not. And it's not just about being understood. Like you said, Ryan, it's about creating opportunities. After I started practicing how to explain my job in a simpler way, I found that more people became interested in what I do. And I got invited to participate in different projects or collaborations because they finally understood what I brought to the table. It's amazing how clear communication can open doors you didn't even know were there.
Exactly. And that's really the point. We're not just talking about being able to say what your job is. We're talking about making it meaningful for the person you're speaking to, and in turn, creating opportunities for yourself. So now that we understand why this is so important, let's get into the practical steps on how to do it right. All right, now that we've laid the foundation, let's dive into the practical part. How to actually structure what you say when someone asks, "What do you do?" It can be overwhelming, especially if your job is complex, but there's a simple structure you can use to make it easier. I like to break it down into 3 parts: your job title, your main responsibilities, and why your job matters. This approach keeps things clear and concise, and you can tailor it depending on who you're talking to. For example, let's say you're a software engineer. Instead of saying something broad like, I develop software, you could say, I'm a software engineer and I work on creating applications that help businesses automate their processes. It's great because it reduces errors and saves time for companies. See how that adds a little more depth without being too technical? You're explaining not just what you do, but also why it's important.
Yes. And it's so much easier for people to connect with what you're saying when they understand the impact of your job. I used to fall into the trap of listing all my technical tasks. Like, I manage project timelines, coordinate with teams, and oversee resource allocation. It sounded robotic and didn't resonate with most people. But when I started framing it differently, like, I'm a project manager in the tech industry, and my job is to make sure that projects are completed on time and within budget, helping the team stay focused and clients satisfied. It made a huge difference. That change in how I explain my job helped people outside my field understand what I do, and more importantly, why it matters. And for those in my industry, I'd just add a bit more detail about the tools or methodologies I use, but the core message stays the same. That's the key. Keeping it simple but effective.
Exactly. And I love that example, Priya. You're not just rattling off tasks. You're explaining the value of your work in a way that's easy to digest. And you can tweak it depending on who you're talking to. If it's someone in your industry, you can throw in more specific details. If it's someone outside your field, keep it high level but meaningful. Listeners, here's a quick exercise. Try writing down your job title, your main responsibilities, and why your job matters to your company or clients. Practice saying it out loud in different ways. The more you practice, the more natural it'll feel, and the easier it'll be to adjust your explanation depending on your audience. Now that we've covered the basics of structuring how you talk about your job, let's take it a step further. One of the most important things to remember is that not every audience is the same. You can't explain your job the same way to a colleague that you would to a friend or family member who has no idea what you do. So adapting your explanation based on who you're speaking to is key. For example, if I'm talking to someone in my field, I might get into specific tools or processes I use. But if I'm talking to someone who's not familiar with my industry, I'll keep it simple and focus more on the impact of my work, like how it helps the company or the end user. It's all about being flexible and knowing when to dive deep and when to keep it high level.
Exactly, Ryan. This is something that I struggled with at first. I remember trying to explain my job to my parents. They're not in the tech industry, so every time I mentioned things like agile methodologies or resource allocation, their eyes would just glaze over. It was clear I wasn't getting through. I realized I needed to shift my focus and talk more about the outcomes of my work rather than the technicalities. So now, instead of saying, I manage project teams, I say, I make sure the project gets done on time so the company can meet its goals without wasting resources. That's something they can understand. And even in professional settings, like when I'm talking to clients, I always adjust based on their background. If they're not tech savvy, I keep my language simple and focus on the value I bring, like delivering a project smoothly. But if I'm talking to a peer in the industry, I might mention the specific tools or project management strategies I use, like Jira or Gantt charts, because I know they'll get it.
That's a great point, Priya. It's not about dumbing down your explanation. It's about making it relevant to the person you're speaking to. You can still convey your expertise without overloading them with unnecessary details. And this skill of adjusting how you explain your job can be really valuable, especially in situations like networking or interviews where you don't always know how much the other person knows about your field. Here's a practical takeaway for our listeners. Think of 2 or 3 different ways to describe your job. One for a general audience, one for professionals in your industry, and one for people who might not be familiar with your work at all. Practice switching between these versions depending on who you're talking to, and you'll find it gets easier with time.
Exactly. And once you start doing this, you'll notice conversations flowing more smoothly, and people will engage more with what you're saying because they'll actually understand it. And when people understand, they ask more questions, which leads to better opportunities.
Now, we all know that even with the best structure and tailoring your explanation, there are still challenges that can come up when you're trying to talk about your job, especially in English if it's not your first language or if you're dealing with complex roles. So, let's talk about some of these common challenges and how to overcome them. One of the biggest challenges people face is nerves. You might feel anxious or unsure about whether you're using the right words or if you're explaining yourself clearly. This is totally normal, but the good news is that it gets easier with practice. One thing I always recommend is to practice speaking about your job out loud. It could be to a friend, in front of a mirror, or even recording yourself. The more you do it, the more natural it will feel, and you'll start noticing areas where you can improve.
Yes, I completely relate to that. In fact, I used to struggle a lot with vocabulary. Sometimes I couldn't find the right English word to explain a concept, and it would make me feel frustrated. But I realized that it's okay to take a moment to gather your thoughts and simplify the language. You don't have to be perfect. What's important is that your message gets across. For example, there was a time I couldn't think of the word for resource allocation when I was talking to a client. So instead, I just said, I make sure we have the right people and tools in place to get the job done efficiently. The client understood perfectly, and that's the main goal. Communicating in a way that makes sense, even if you have to find alternative words. And like you said, Ryan, recording yourself can be super helpful. I did that, and it really showed me which parts of my explanation were too complex or unclear.
Absolutely, and it's also about pacing yourself. If you feel like you're getting lost in the explanation or using too many technical terms, slow down and take a breath. Sometimes we rush through explanations when we're nervous, and that just makes it harder for the listener to follow along. So, don't be afraid to pause, regroup, and keep things simple. Another challenge people often face is explaining something too technical to a non-expert. Here's a tip. Think about how you would explain your job to someone who has no idea about your field. Maybe a family member or a friend who works in a completely different industry. Break it down to the essentials without the jargon and focus on the value or outcome of your work.
Yes, that's such a great way to think about it. And it's also helpful to remember that no one expects you to give a perfect textbook explanation. The goal is to communicate clearly, not impress people with fancy terms. It's totally okay to take your time and adjust based on the person you're speaking to. And like anything else, the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get.
Exactly. So for our listeners, if you're struggling with nerves, vocabulary, or explaining something too complex, just remember that it's all about practice and pacing. Start simple, focus on the key points, and keep refining how you talk about your job. And don't be afraid to use alternative words or explanations when needed. What matters most is that the person you're speaking to understands you. Now that we've talked about overcoming those common challenges, let's focus on something equally important: building confidence and staying consistent. Being able to talk about your job with ease isn't just about getting it right once. It's about making it a natural part of your conversations. And that takes consistency. Now that we've talked about overcoming those common challenges, let's focus on something equally important: building confidence and staying consistent. Talking about your job confidently isn't about getting it right just once. It's about making it a natural part of your everyday conversations. And that takes consistency. When you keep speaking about your work, even casually, it starts to feel more comfortable and authentic.
Absolutely, Ryan. And remember, confidence grows when you truly know your subject. Dive into what excites you about your work. What are the parts that make you feel proud or fulfilled? Start with those moments. Sharing stories or specific achievements can make it easier for others to understand your role and value. Plus, it brings personality to what you're saying, making you sound genuine and enthusiastic.
And don't forget, it's okay to take pauses. If you're nervous, a brief pause gives you a moment to collect your thoughts. You don't have to rush or fill every silence. Sometimes, a well-placed pause can even add impact to what you're sharing, showing that you're thoughtful and engaged in the conversation. And one last tip: ask questions and listen too. When you show interest in the other person's experiences or thoughts, it makes the conversation a two-way street. That way, you're not just talking about your job, but also connecting with your audience. This approach makes the whole conversation feel balanced and natural rather than just one-sided.
Confidence comes with practice, so talk about your job with different people and in different ways. Soon, it'll feel natural. Remember, the goal isn't just to explain what you do, but to make it relatable and memorable. If you found these tips helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more advice on building confidence and improving communication. We're here to support your journey to confident self-expression.